Your brain uses the same amount of energy overthinking a decision as it does solving complex mathematical equations. The difference: one moves you forward, the other keeps you paralyzed. Rachel Morrison spent 15 years studying this phenomenon at Stanford's Neuroscience Institute, and what she discovered about chronic overthinkers was both surprising and disturbing. The human brain, she found, doesn't distinguish between productive thinking and destructive overthinking when it comes to energy consumption. Both drain your mental resources at the same rate. But here's where it gets interesting and a little unsettling. Chronic overthinkers don't just waste mental energy, they actually rewire their neural pathways to make overthinking the default mode of operation. Today, we're going to explore how overthinking hijacks your mind, why intelligent people are often the most vulnerable to it, and most importantly, how you can break free from this exhausting mental trap. Meet David Chen, a 34-year-old software engineer living in Seattle. On paper, his life looked successful: six-figure salary, respected position at a major tech company, healthy relationships. But inside his mind, a different story was unfolding. Every morning, David would wake up at 6 a.m. and before his feet even touched the floor, his mind would start racing. Should he wear the blue shirt or the grey one? What if the blue one made him look unprofessional for the client meeting? But wait, was the meeting even confirmed? He should check his email. But what if checking email first thing stressed him out? By the time he actually got out of bed, 15 minutes had passed, and he hadn't moved an inch. This pattern continued throughout his day. At breakfast, he'd spend 10 minutes deciding between oatmeal and eggs, weighing the nutritional benefits, the time it would take to prepare each option, whether he'd feel satisfied until lunch. At work, simple email responses would take 30 minutes to craft. As he analyzed every word, every punctuation mark, every possible interpretation, his colleagues saw him as thorough and careful. They didn't see the mental exhaustion. They didn't see him lying awake at 2 a.m., replaying conversations from 3 days ago, analyzing what he should have said differently. David's story isn't unique. According to research published in the Journal of Cognitive Psychology, approximately 73% of adults aged 25 to 35 identify as chronic overthinkers, and that number jumps to 85% among individuals with higher education levels. Dr. Morrison's research revealed something fascinating about this demographic. She discovered that people with higher IQs and advanced education aren't just more prone to overthinking, they're actually more vulnerable to its most damaging effect. Intelligence gives you more tools to analyze situations, Dr. Morrison explained in her research paper, but without proper mental discipline, those same tools become weapons of self-sabotage. Smart people can generate more scenarios, more possibilities, more potential outcomes. They can see problems from multiple angles, which sounds like an advantage, but it often leads to analysis paralysis. She called it the intelligence paradox. The very cognitive abilities that help you succeed in academic and professional settings can trap you in endless mental loops when applied incorrectly. Let's understand what's actually happening in the brain during overthinking. When you face a decision or situation, your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for complex thinking and decision-making, activates. This is normal and necessary. The prefrontal cortex evaluates options, considers consequences, and helps you make informed choices. But in overthinkers, something different happens. The prefrontal cortex doesn't just activate, it goes into overdrive. It starts generating scenario after scenario, possibility after possibility, without ever reaching a conclusion. Meanwhile, your amygdala, the brain's fear center, starts firing as well, adding emotional weight to each scenario your prefrontal cortex generates. This creates what neuroscientists call a rumination loop. Your thinking brain generates a worry. Your emotional brain amplifies that worry, which triggers more thinking, which generates more emotion, which triggers more thinking, and the cycle continues. The energy cost is enormous. Your brain represents only 2% of your body weight, but uses approximately 20% of your body's total energy. When you're caught in a rumination loop, that energy consumption can spike even higher. It's like leaving your car engine running in park, burning fuel without going anywhere. But here's what makes overthinking particularly insidious. It feels productive. When you're overthinking, you're not being lazy. You're actively engaging with problems. You're considering options. You're being careful and thorough. It feels like you're doing something important. David certainly felt this way. When his girlfriend Emma suggested he might be overthinking things, he defended himself. "I'm not overthinking," he'd say. "I'm being careful. I'm considering all the angles. That's what responsible people do." And in a way, he was right. The line between careful consideration and overthinking isn't always clear. So how do you tell the difference? Dr. Morrison identified 3 key indicators that separate productive thinking from destructive overthinking. First, productive thinking moves toward resolution. Overthinking circles endlessly without reaching conclusions. If you've been thinking about the same decision for days or weeks without getting closer to an answer, you're overthinking. Second, productive thinking considers realistic scenarios. Overthinking generates increasingly unlikely, catastrophic possibilities. If you find yourself worrying about scenario chains, what if this happens, and then this happens, and then this other thing happens? You're overthinking. Third, productive thinking has a stopping point. Overthinking continues, even after decisions are made. If you're still analyzing choices after you've already committed to them, you're overthinking. For David, all 3 indicators were flashing red, but he couldn't see it, or perhaps more accurately, he didn't want to see it. 6 months into his overthinking spiral, David started noticing physical symptoms. He was tired all the time, despite sleeping 8 hours a night. He'd developed tension headaches that painkillers barely touch. His stomach was constantly uneasy, and he'd lost 10 pounds without trying. His doctor ran tests. Everything came back normal. "It's stress," the doctor said. "You need to find ways to relax." But David didn't feel stressed. He felt busy, yes, and mentally tired, but he didn't think of himself as stressed. Stress was for people with real problems, he thought. He was just being thorough. What David didn't understand, what many overthinkers don't understand, is that chronic overthinking is one of the most stressful things you can subject your body to. It's not the dramatic, acute stress of facing an immediate threat. It's the chronic, low-grade stress of constant mental activation, and in many ways, it's more damaging. Dr. James Patterson, a psychologist specializing in anxiety disorders, has studied the physical effects of chronic overthinking for over 2 decades. His findings paint a concerning picture. When you're overthinking, your body is in a constant state of mild activation, Dr. Patterson explained. Your cortisol levels stay elevated. Your sympathetic nervous system, your fight or flight system, never fully turns off. It's like driving with one foot on the gas and one foot on the brake. The long-term effects can be severe. Chronic overthinkers have higher rates of insomnia and poor sleep quality because the mind won't quiet down even when the body is exhausted. Digestive issues, because stress hormones affect gut function, weakened immune systems, because chronic stress suppresses immune response, cardiovascular problems, because constant mental stress affects heart health, anxiety and depression, because overthinking reinforces negative thought patterns, but the costs aren't just physical. The psychological and social costs of overthinking can be equally devastating. David's relationship with Emma began to suffer. She'd ask simple questions. Where do you want to eat dinner? Or should we watch a movie tonight? And David would launch into extensive analysis. 20 minutes later, they still wouldn't have an answer, and Emma would be frustrated. It's like you can't just be, she told him during one argument. Everything has to be analyzed and optimized and considered from every angle. Sometimes, David, the right answer is just yes, or this one sounds good. You're making everything so complicated. David felt misunderstood. He was trying to make good decisions, to consider her preferences, to do things right. How was that a problem? But Emma's frustration highlighted another hidden cost of overthinking. It damages relationships. When you overthink every interaction, every conversation, every decision, you stop being present. You're so busy analyzing what just happened or worrying about what might happen that you miss what's actually happening right now. Dr. Morrison's research identified this as temporal displacement. Overthinkers spend so much time in the past, analyzing what was said or done, or the future, worrying about what might happen, that they barely exist in the present moment. Relationships require presence, Dr. Morrison noted. When someone is speaking to you, really speaking to you, and you're simultaneously analyzing their words, predicting their reactions, planning your responses 3 sentences ahead, and reviewing what you said 5 minutes ago, you're not really there, and people feel that absence. Emma certainly felt it. Over time, she stopped asking David for input on small decisions. She'd just pick a restaurant, choose a movie, make plans. It was easier than waiting for him to finish his mental calculations, but this created its own problem. David felt excluded and began overthinking why Emma wasn't asking his opinion anymore. The irony was painful. His attempt to be considerate and careful was pushing away the person he cared about most. At work, David's overthinking was costing him opportunities. His manager, Robert, had noticed David's thoroughness and initially saw it as an asset, but over time it became a liability. When Robert assigned David to lead a new project, David spent 3 weeks planning. He created detailed documentation, analyzed every possible risk, developed contingency plans for contingencies. The project timeline said they should start development in 1 week. David needed more time to plan. David, this is excellent work, Robert told him, reviewing the documentation. But we needed to start 2 weeks ago. While you've been planning, our competitor launched a similar feature. We've lost our window. David felt the criticism like a physical blow. He'd been trying to do things right, to avoid mistakes, to be prepared, and instead he'd failed by being too prepared. This pattern repeated. Projects were delayed. Opportunities were missed. Simpler solutions were overlooked in favor of complex, overanalyzed alternatives. Robert eventually had a frank conversation with David. "You're one of the smartest engineers on the team," he said, "but you're letting perfect be the enemy of good. In this industry, a good solution implemented today beats a perfect solution implemented next month. You need to learn when to stop planning and start doing." The feedback stung, but it also planted a seed. Maybe, David thought, there was something to Emma's concerns. Maybe there was something to his constant exhaustion. Maybe overthinking wasn't the asset he thought it was. Research supports Robert's observation about the professional costs of overthinking. A study by the Harvard Business Review found that chronic overthinkers take 37% longer to make decisions than their peers, with no measurable improvement in decision quality. In fast-paced industries, this delay can be career-limiting. Moreover, overthinkers often struggle with another crucial professional skill: adaptability. When you've spent weeks analyzing and planning, you become invested in your analysis. You become rigid. But in dynamic environments, the ability to pivot quickly is often more valuable than the ability to plan perfectly. There's also the opportunity cost. Every hour David spent overthinking a decision was an hour he wasn't spending on execution, innovation, or relationship building. The most successful people, research shows, aren't necessarily the ones who make the best decisions. They're the ones who make good enough decisions quickly and then adapt as they learn. But perhaps the deepest cost of chronic overthinking is how it affects your sense of self. David had always prided himself on his intelligence and careful thinking. But somewhere along the way, those qualities had transformed from assets into identity. He wasn't someone who thought carefully. He was a careful thinker. That was who he was. This identity made it nearly impossible to change. Reducing his overthinking felt like betraying himself, like becoming less intelligent, less careful, less David. Dr. Morrison calls this cognitive identity fusion. When your thinking patterns become inseparable from your sense of self, changing those patterns feels like losing yourself. This is why telling an overthinker to just stop overthinking is not only unhelpful, it's threatening to their identity. The night David hit his breaking point, he was lying in bed, unable to sleep, mentally replaying a 2-sentence email exchange from 4 days earlier. He was analyzing the punctuation in his colleague's response, trying to determine if it indicated annoyance or just brevity. Suddenly, a thought cut through the mental fog. This is absurd. He was a grown man, lying awake at 3 a.m., analyzing a period and a comma in an email about a routine meeting. The thought wasn't self-critical or judgmental, it was simply observational. And in that observation, something shifted. This is absurd, he thought again, and I don't want to live like this anymore. The next morning, David did something he hadn't done in years. He made a decision without analyzing it. When his alarm went off, instead of lying in bed, running through his morning options, he simply got up. Blue shirt or grey? He grabbed the first one he saw, oatmeal or eggs, whatever his hand reached first. The decisions weren't perfect. The shirt didn't match his pants as well as the other one would have. The oatmeal left him slightly hungry before lunch. But something interesting happened. Nothing bad occurred. The world didn't end. No one commented on his shirt. His slight hunger was easily ignorable. More importantly, he saved 45 minutes of mental energy that morning. David didn't know it, but he was stumbling onto one of the key principles that Dr. Morrison's research had identified: the power of immediate action. The overthinking loop requires time and space to activate, Dr. Morrison explained in her research. It needs the gap between stimulus and response. When you act immediately, you deny overthinking that necessary gap. You interrupt the pattern before it can establish itself. This doesn't mean acting impulsively or recklessly. It means distinguishing between decisions that require careful analysis and decisions that don't, and then acting decisively on the latter category. Dr. Morrison developed a framework called the decision hierarchy, which categorizes decisions into 4 levels. Level 1, micro decisions. What to wear, what to eat, which route to take. Impact, minimal. Required analysis. Second, ideal response, immediate action. Level 2, minor decisions. Accepting a social invitation, choosing a restaurant, buying household items. Impact, low. Required analysis, minute. Ideal response, quick evaluation, then commitment. Level 3, moderate decisions. Job offers, major purchases, relationship milestones. Impact, significant. Required analysis, hours to days. Ideal response, structured analysis, with a deadline. Level 4, major decisions. Career changes, moving cities, life partnerships. Impact, life-changing. Required analysis, weeks to month. Ideal response, comprehensive evaluation with clear decision points. The problem with overthinkers, Dr. Morrison noted, is they apply level 4 analysis to level 1 decisions. They're using nuclear weapons to swat flies. David's breakthrough that morning was unconsciously applying appropriate levels of analysis. His shirt and breakfast were level 1 decisions. They deserved seconds of thought, not minutes. By acting immediately, he preserved his mental energy for decisions that actually mattered. But breaking the overthinking habit requires more than just occasionally acting quickly. It requires understanding and rewiring the neural pathways that make overthinking your default mode. This is where the neuroscience becomes fascinating and hopeful. Your brain is neuroplastic, meaning it can change and adapt throughout your life. The neural pathways that make overthinking feel automatic weren't hardwired from birth. They were developed through repetition. And what was learned through repetition can be unlearned through different repetition. Think of your neural pathways like trails in a forest. The more you walk a particular trail, the more defined it becomes. Eventually, it's the obvious path, the easy path, the automatic path. Overthinking is a well-worn trail in your mental forest. But if you stop walking that trail and start walking a different one, the old trail gradually grows over, and the new trail becomes the obvious path. Dr. Michael Chen, a neuroscientist at MIT, has studied this process extensively. His research shows that breaking habitual thought patterns requires three key elements. First, awareness. You must catch yourself in the overthinking pattern. This is harder than it sounds, because overthinking feels productive. It feels like you're doing something important. Second, interruption. Once you're aware, you must interrupt the pattern before it gains momentum. This is the critical moment, the gap between recognizing overthinking and being swept away by it. Third, replacement. You can't just stop overthinking. You must replace it with a different response. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does your brain. If you don't give it something else to do, it'll default back to overthinking. David began implementing these principles. Though his progress wasn't linear, he started with awareness. He'd catch himself starting to overthink, analyzing an email, replaying a conversation, worrying about a future scenario, and he'd simply notice it, not judge it, not fight it, just notice it. I'm overthinking again, he'd think, with the same neutral observation you might use to notice it's raining. This simple act of labeling was surprisingly powerful. Research by Dr. Matthew Lieberman at UCLA has shown that verbally labeling emotions and thoughts reduces their intensity. The act of saying I'm overthinking creates a tiny bit of distance between you and the thought, weakening its grip. Next came interruption. When David noticed overthinking starting, he'd physically interrupt the pattern. Sometimes he'd stand up and move to a different location. Sometimes he'd take 3 deep breaths. Sometimes he'd splash cold water on his face. The specific action mattered less than the fact that he was disrupting the pattern. He was teaching his brain that overthinking wasn't the only option, wasn't the automatic response. Then came replacement, finding something else to do with his mental energy. Dr. Morrison recommends what she calls productive redirection. Instead of trying to empty your mind, which is nearly impossible for overthinkers, give your mind something specific to focus on. David experimented with several techniques. A 5 senses exercise. When he caught himself overthinking, he'd stop and identify 5 things he could see, 4 things he could hear, 3 things he could touch, 2 things he could smell, and 1 thing he could taste. This forced his attention into the present moment and out of the overthinking loop. The action inventory. Instead of thinking about a problem, he'd write down 3 specific actions he could take right now. Not perfect actions, not fully analyzed actions, just 3 things he could physically do in the next hour. Then he'd pick one and do it. The time box. He'd set a timer for 5 minutes and allow himself to think about the problem intensely. During those 5 minutes, when the timer went off, he was done. No more thinking about it until tomorrow's 5-minute session. This channeled his analytical energy into constrained, productive time periods, instead of letting it sprawl across his entire day. The 40-70 rule. Based on Colin Powell's decision-making principle, David started making decisions when he had between 40–70% of the information he thought he might need. Less than 40%, and you're being reckless. More than 70%, and you're overthinking. This gave him a concrete guideline for when to stop analyzing and commit. None of these techniques worked perfectly. Some days, David would catch himself 2 hours deep in an overthinking spiral before remembering to interrupt it. Other days, he'd successfully redirect his first overthinking episode, then fall into another one an hour later, but gradually, something shifted. The overthinking episodes became shorter. The time between recognizing overthinking and interrupting it decreased. The new neural pathways, the awareness, interruption and replacement pathways were getting stronger. The old overthinking pathway was still there, but it was growing over, becoming less automatic. 3 months into this practice, David noticed something remarkable during his morning routine. He'd gotten dressed, eaten breakfast, and was heading out the door when he realized he hadn't overthought any of it. He'd just done it. The actions had flowed naturally, without the exhausting mental commentary that usually accompanied them. It wasn't that he'd become careless or stopped thinking. He'd simply stopped overthinking. His mind had found the appropriate level of analysis for the situation, and then moved on. Emma noticed the change before David did. "You seem lighter," she told him one evening. They were cooking dinner together, something they hadn't done in months, because David's overthinking had made even this simple activity exhausting. "Lighter?" David asked, chopping vegetables without analyzing whether he was cutting them the optimal size. "Yeah, like there's less weight on you. You're more here." She gestured around them, present, in the moment. David considered this, briefly, without spiraling into analysis, and realized she was right. He felt lighter. The constant hum of mental activity that had been his background noise for years had quieted, not disappeared. He was still thinking, still processing, but the frantic, desperate quality was gone. But this lightness came with an unexpected challenge: guilt. Part of David had believed that his overthinking was what made him good at his job, what made him careful and responsible, what made him intelligent. Reducing his overthinking felt in some ways like becoming less capable. When he made quick decisions now, a voice in his head would sometimes whisper, "You should think about this more. You're being careless. You're going to miss something important." This voice was the old neural pathway, trying to reassert itself, trying to convince him that overthinking was protection rather than prison. Dr. Morrison calls this the responsibility fallacy, the belief that more thinking equals more responsibility, but her research shows the opposite is often true. Overthinking creates an illusion of control. Dr. Morrison explained, "We believe that if we just think about something enough, we can predict every outcome, prevent every problem, make the perfect choice. But life doesn't work that way. There are always unknown variables. There will always be unexpected outcomes. Overthinking doesn't eliminate uncertainty. It just exhausts you while uncertainty remains." True responsibility, she argues, isn't about trying to predict and prevent every possible problem. It's about making the best decision you can with available information, then adapting as new information emerges. David began to see his earlier behavior in a new light. His overthinking hadn't been making him more responsible. It had been a way of avoiding responsibility. As long as he was still thinking, still analyzing, still considering, he didn't have to commit. He didn't have to take action. He didn't have to accept the inherent uncertainty of decision-making. This realization was uncomfortable, but it was also liberating. He started viewing quick decisions not as carelessness, but as courage, the courage to act despite uncertainty, to commit despite imperfection, to move forward despite not having all the answers. At work, this shift had immediate effect. Robert assigned him to lead another project, and David approached it differently. Instead of spending weeks on comprehensive planning, he spent 2 days on basic planning, then started implementation. Issues arose, of course they did, but David and his team addressed them as they appeared, adapting in real time. The project launched on time. It wasn't perfect, but it was good. And because they'd launched quickly, they received user feedback that informed improvements. Within 2 months, the product was better than anything David could have designed in his original planning phase, because it was informed by actual use, rather than theoretical analysis. "This is exactly what I was hoping for," Robert told him during their review meeting. "You're still thorough and careful, but now you're also decisive and adaptable. That combination is powerful." David felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. Pride without anxiety. He'd done good work, and he could simply accept that without immediately analyzing all the ways it could have been better. In his relationship with Emma, the changes were even more pronounced. They were planning a vacation, something that previously would have triggered weeks of overthinking. Where should they go? What was the optimal time? Which flight had the best price to convenience ratio? What if the weather was bad? What if they didn't enjoy the destination? But this time, David approached it differently. "Where do you want to go?" he asked Emma. "I've been wanting to visit Portugal," she said. "Great," David replied. "Let's do that." Emma looked at him suspiciously. "You're not going to research 50 destinations and create a comparison spreadsheet?" David laughed. "You want to go to Portugal? That sounds good to me. Let's book it." They found flights that seemed reasonable, booked a hotel with good reviews, and made a loose list of things they might want to see. The whole process took 2 hours instead of 2 weeks. The vacation itself was wonderful, though not perfect. It rained 2 of the 7 days. The hotel room was smaller than the photos suggested. They missed a museum they'd wanted to see because they got the closing time wrong. Old David would have spiraled over these imperfections, analyzing what went wrong, how he should have planned better, whether they should have chosen a different destination. New David shrugged and enjoyed the parts that were good. The rain led them to discover a cozy bookstore they otherwise would have missed. The small hotel room didn't matter because they spent most of their time exploring. They saw different museums instead, which were equally interesting. "This is the most relaxed I've seen you in years," Emma told him on the 4th day. They were sitting at a cafe, drinking wine, watching people walk by. "I'm learning to let things be imperfect," David said. "It's harder than it sounds, but also easier than I thought it would be." Emma squeezed his hand. "I'm proud of you." Those 4 words, "I'm proud of you," carried weight that David hadn't expected. He realized that his overthinking hadn't just been exhausting for him. It had been exhausting for everyone around him. His change hadn't just improved his own life, it had improved the lives of people who cared about him. 6 months into his journey, David felt different, not perfect. He still had days when overthinking crept back, but fundamentally changed. The default setting in his mind had shifted. He began to think of his experience as something that might help others, He wasn't a researcher, therapist, but he'd lived the problem and found a way through it. Maybe his experience had value. He started keeping notes on the techniques that worked best for him, the patterns he'd noticed, the mental shifts that made the biggest difference. Eventually, he organized these notes into what he called his practical framework for overthinkers. The framework had 5 core principles. Principle 1. Distinguish between thinking and overthinking. David realized that most overthinkers struggle because they can't tell the difference between productive thinking and destructive overthinking. They look similar, feel similar, but have different results. He developed a simple test with 3 questions. Am I moving toward a decision, or am I circling? 2. Am I considering realistic scenarios, or am I catastrophizing? 3. Am I gathering useful information, or am I seeking impossible certainty? If the answer to the first part of each question was yes, it was thinking. If the answer to the second part was yes, it was overthinking. This distinction wasn't about judging himself. It was about clarity. Once he could clearly identify overthinking, he could address it. Principle 2. Implement the decision hierarchy. Not all decisions deserve the same mental energy. David learned to quickly categorize decisions and apply appropriate levels of analysis. For level 1 decisions, what to wear, what to eat, he gave himself a 5-second rule. 5 seconds to decide, then commit. These decisions had minimal impact, and spending more time on them was pure waste. For level 2 decisions, social plans, minor purchases, he allowed himself 5 minutes of consideration, enough to make an informed choice, not enough to spiral. For level 3 decisions, job offers, major purchases, he'd set aside specific thinking time, maybe an hour or 2 spread across a few days, then make a decision. He'd also consult trusted people for input, using their perspectives to shortcut his analysis. For level 4 decisions, career changes, major life moves, he allowed himself longer consideration, but with structured check-ins. He'd set decision deadlines and stick to them, preventing indefinite rumination. Principle 3. Action interrupts rumination. David discovered that the fastest way to stop overthinking was to start doing. Action and rumination cannot coexist in the same moment. When you're actively engaged in a task, your mind has to focus on execution rather than analysis. Whenever he caught himself overthinking, he'd ask, what's one small thing I can do right now related to this situation? Not the perfect thing, not the fully analyzed thing, just one small, concrete action. Overthinking about an email. Send a draft to yourself and revise it once, then send it. Overthinking about a project. Open the document and write 1 paragraph. Overthinking about a conversation. Send a text suggesting a time to talk. The action didn't have to solve the problem. It just had to interrupt the rumination and create forward momentum. Principle 4. Practice selective ignorance. This principle was the hardest for David, but ultimately the most liberating. Selective ignorance means deliberately choosing not to gather certain information, even when you could. It means accepting that more information isn't always better. David learned to ask himself, will this information change my decision or just give me more to analyze? If gathering more information would genuinely help him make a better choice, he'd gather it. But if it would just feed his overthinking without improving the decision, he'd deliberately stop researching. When booking flights, for example, he'd check 2 or 3 options, pick the best one among them, and stop. He wouldn't check 20 options to ensure he'd found the absolute cheapest flight. The mental energy saved was worth more than the $20 he might save. This wasn't about being uninformed. It was about being strategically informed, gathering enough information to make a good decision, then stopping before the information became paralyzing. Principle 5. Build confidence through imperfect action. David realized that overthinking was, at its core, a confidence problem. He didn't trust himself to make good decisions, so he tried to think his way to certainty before acting. But confidence isn't built through thinking, it's built through action, specifically through taking imperfect action and discovering that you can handle the results. Every time David made a quick decision and things turned out fine, his brain logged that data point. Every time he made a mistake, but successfully dealt with it, his brain learned that mistakes weren't catastrophic. Over time, these experiences accumulated into a different belief. I can handle uncertainty. I can make imperfect decisions and adapt as needed. I don't need to predict every outcome to move forward successfully. This confidence didn't eliminate uncertainty. Uncertainty is inherent to life, but it eliminated the fear of uncertainty, which was what had been fueling his overthinking. David also noticed something interesting. His decision-making quality hadn't decreased. In fact, by some measures it had improved. He was making faster decisions, which allowed him to implement them sooner and learn from real-world feedback. His decisions were more adaptive because he wasn't locked into overanalyzed plans. The decisions weren't perfect, but they were good enough. And good enough, executed quickly, beat perfect executed slowly. The changes in David's life extended far beyond his overthinking habits. His physical health improved dramatically. The tension headaches disappeared. His sleep quality increased. When his mind wasn't churning through analysis all night, his body could actually rest. He regained the weight he'd lost and felt energized in a way he hadn't experienced in years. His relationship with Emma deepened. With less mental energy spent on rumination, he had more presence for actual connection. Their conversations became richer because David was fully engaged rather than simultaneously analyzing everything being said. Emma noticed that David laughed more. He'd always had a good sense of humor, but overthinking had muted it, made everything feel heavy and serious. Now, he could be playful again, spontaneous, like, "I feel like I got you back," Emma told him one night. "The version of you I fell in love with." He's been in there the whole time, just buried under all that thinking. At work, David's career accelerated. With overthinking no longer bottlenecking his decisions, he could move faster, take on more projects, demonstrate leadership. 6 months after his breakthrough, Robert promoted him to senior engineer with team leadership responsibilities. "You've always been technically excellent," Robert told him during the promotion conversation. "But now you've added decisiveness and adaptability. That combination makes you leadership material." David's team appreciated his management style. He was thorough, without being paralyzing, careful without being perfectionist. He created an environment where people could make decisions without fear of judgment, learn from mistakes without punishment, and move quickly without recklessness. One of his team members, a junior engineer named Sarah, approached him one day with a confession. "I've been struggling with overthinking everything," she told him. "I see how quickly and confidently you make decisions, and I don't know how you do it. I spend hours on things that should take minutes." David smiled, recognizing himself in her words. He shared his story, not as an expert dispensing wisdom, but as someone who'd been in her position and found a way through. "The secret," he told her, "isn't to stop thinking. It's to think proportionally. Small decisions get small thinking. Big decisions get big thinking. And then, either way, you commit and adapt." Sarah found this helpful, and word spread. Other team members started asking David for advice on decision-making and overthinking. He realized he'd accidentally become a resource for people struggling with the same issues that had once paralyzed him. This gave David a sense of purpose he hadn't expected. His struggle hadn't been pointless suffering. It had been preparation to help others. He started a simple practice with his team. In meetings, when someone was clearly overthinking a decision, he'd gently ask, on a scale of 1 to 4, using the decision hierarchy, "What level is this decision?" Usually, people would pause, reassess, and realize they were applying level 3 or 4, thinking to a level 1 or 2 decision. This simple question helped them right-size their analysis. The team's velocity increased. Projects moved faster. People felt less stressed. The quality of work remained high, but the suffering involved in producing that work decreased dramatically. David's own relationship with thinking had transformed. He'd gone from viewing thinking as something to do more of, believing more analysis would yield better results, to viewing thinking as a tool to be used skillfully. You don't use a sledgehammer to hang a picture frame. You don't use a scalpel to chop firewood. Different tools for different jobs. Different levels of thinking for different decisions. This perspective extended to other areas of his life. He applied the same principles to his health, his hobbies, his social life. Instead of overthinking whether to go to the gym, he just went. Instead of analyzing which book to read next, he picked one that seemed interesting. Instead of ruminating about whether to accept social invitations, he used a simple rule. If his first instinct was yes, he said yes. Life became simpler, but not in a reductive way. It became simpler in the way that removing clutter from a room makes the room more spacious and peaceful. He'd removed mental clutter, and the space that remained was filled with actual living rather than endless analysis about living. 1 year after his breaking point, that 3 a.m. moment when he recognized the absurdity of analyzing email punctuation, David sat down and reflected on the journey. He made a list of things that had changed. Average time to make a minor decision from 15 to 20 minutes to 30-60 seconds. Hours of sleep per night from 5 to 6. Tension headaches per month from 50. Relationship satisfaction from 410. Work project completion rate increased by 5. General life satisfaction from 5-10. But the numbers didn't capture the real change. The real change was internal. David had stopped fighting with himself. The constant mental warfare, should I, shouldn't I, what if, why didn't I, had quieted. His mind had become an ally rather than an adversary. He still thought carefully about important things. He still considered options and analyzed situations, but he did it proportionally, intentionally, and with the ability to stop when thinking became overthinking. The difference between his old self and his new self wasn't that he'd become less intelligent or less careful. It was that he'd become wiser about how to apply his intelligence and when to exercise his caution. As David helped more people with overthinking, he noticed patterns in what worked. Different people needed different approaches, but certain practices seemed universally helpful. He distilled these into 8 core practices that became his standard recommendations. Practice 1. A morning decision fast. The first hour of your day sets your mental tone, and if you start with overthinking, you prime your brain for more overthinking throughout the day. David implemented a decision fast. For his first hour, he'd prepare everything the night before: clothes, breakfast, morning routine, and then execute without analysis. No decisions, no thinking, just action following a simple script. This preserved his mental energy for when he actually needed it, and broke the pattern of starting each day in overthinking mode. People he shared this with reported it was surprisingly difficult at first. The impulse to analyze morning choices was deeply ingrained, but after a week or two, it became liberating. Mornings became peaceful rather than exhausting. Practice 2. The thought record. David started keeping a simple journal with 3 columns. Situation: what was I thinking about? Duration: how long did I think about it? Outcome: did the thinking lead to a decision or action? This practice created awareness without judgment. He wasn't trying to stop overthinking through sheer willpower. He was simply observing it, tracking it, understanding it. Over time, patterns emerged. He noticed he overthought most in the evenings when he was tired. He noticed certain topics triggered more overthinking than others. He noticed that 80% of his overthinking led nowhere. No decision, no action, just mental exhaustion. This data was powerful. It turned vague feelings, "I think I overthink too much," into concrete evidence, and evidence is harder to deny than feelings. Practice 3. The 5-minute rule. When facing a decision, David would set a timer for 5 minutes and think intensely during that time. He'd consider options, analyze implications, weigh pros and cons. When the timer ended, he'd make the decision based on whatever he'd concluded during those 5 minutes. No extensions, no coming back to it later. 5 minutes, then commitment. This practice did 2 things. First, it contained his analytical thinking to a specific time period, preventing it from sprawling across hours or days. Second, it proved to him that 5 minutes of focused thinking was usually enough to make a good decision. For bigger decisions, he'd extend the time, maybe 3 5-minute sessions across 3 days. But the principle remained: bounded thinking time, then commitment. Practice 4. The confidence journal. Every evening David would write down 3 decisions he'd made that day and how they turned out. Not just good decisions, all decisions, chose the chicken sandwich. It was fine. Sent the email without rereading it 5 times. Response was positive. Declined the optional meeting. Used the time productively. This practice served as evidence that his quick decisions generally turned out fine. His brain, always looking for patterns, started to recognize quick decisions aren't dangerous. We handle uncertainty well. We can trust our judgment. Practice 5. The catastrophe check. When David caught himself overthinking a worst-case scenario, he'd run through a simple checklist. 1. What's the actual worst thing that could happen? 2. How likely is that outcome? Realistically. 3. If it did happen, could I handle it? 4. Have I faced similar situations before and survived? Usually the actual worst outcome was far less terrible than his anxious mind suggested, and even when the worst outcome was genuinely bad, he realized he could probably handle it. This practice didn't eliminate worry, but it right-sized it. Instead of vague, catastrophic anxiety, he'd have specific, manageable concerns. Practice 6. The decision audit. Once a month, David would review major decisions he'd made and evaluate them honestly. Did I spend an appropriate amount of time on this decision? What was the outcome? If I could remake this decision, what would I do differently? This practice provided 2 benefits. First, it showed him that his faster decision-making wasn't leading to worse outcomes. Second, when he did make mistakes, he could learn from them without spiraling into self-criticism. Mistakes became data points rather than evidence of failure. I learned X from this is a very different mental experience than I'm bad at decisions. Practice 7. The delegation practice. David realized he overthought, partly because he believed no one else could make decisions as carefully as he could. This belief made him feel responsible for every decision, even minor ones. He started deliberately delegating decisions to others, not just at work, but in his personal life too. You choose the restaurant tonight. You pick the movie. You decide which approach we take on this project. 2 things happened. First, other people's decisions usually turned out fine, which challenged his belief that his extensive analysis was necessary. Second, by trusting others' judgment, he built trust in his own ability to make decisions without exhaustive analysis. If other people could make good decisions without overthinking, maybe he could too. Practice 8. The physical interrupt. David discovered that overthinking lived not just in his mind, but in his body. When he was overthinking, his shoulders tensed, his jaw clenched, his breathing became shallow. He learned to use physical changes to interrupt mental patterns. When he noticed overthinking, he'd stand up and stretch. He'd take 3 deep breaths, focusing on the sensation of breathing. He'd go for a short walk, letting his body move while his mind rested. He'd do 10 jumping jacks or push-ups, forcing his attention into physical sensation. The mind and body are deeply connected. When you change your physical state, your mental state shifts too. This wasn't about exercise for health. It was about using the physicality as a tool to interrupt rumination. These 8 practices became David's toolkit. Not every practice worked for every situation, but together they provided options. When one approach didn't work, he'd try another. The practices weren't complicated or revolutionary. They were simple, concrete actions, and that simplicity was their power. Overthinking thrives on complexity and ambiguity. These practices offered clarity and structure. As David became more open about his overthinking journey, people started reaching out to him, not just colleagues, but friends, acquaintances, even friends of friends who'd heard he'd figured out the overthinking thing. Each person's story was unique, but the core struggle was the same. A mind that wouldn't stop analyzing, considering, worrying. A mental engine that couldn't find the off switch. David had a conversation with a woman named Jennifer, a marketing executive who'd been recommended to contact him by a mutual friend. "I can't make any decisions anymore," Jennifer told him over coffee. "Everything feels massive. Should I take this job offer? Should I move apartments? Should I end this relationship? I've been thinking about these things for months, and I'm not any closer to answers. I'm just exhausted." David recognized the desperation in her voice. He'd been there. "Can I ask you something?" David said. "When you're thinking about these decisions, what are you hoping to achieve? What would make you feel ready to decide?" Jennifer paused, considering. "I guess I want to be sure. I want to know I'm making the right choice." "And how sure do you need to be? What percentage?" "I don't know. Completely sure." David nodded. "That's the trap. You're waiting for certainty that doesn't exist. There is no 100% sure for life decisions. There are only levels of confidence, and at some point you have to act despite uncertainty." Jennifer looked troubled. "But what if I make the wrong choice?" "You will," David said. "Simply, you'll make wrong choices. Everyone does. The question isn't how to avoid ever being wrong. It's how to make good enough decisions quickly enough that you can learn and adapt." He shared his decision hierarchy framework, the 5-minute rule, the concept of proportional thinking. He explained that her 3 big decisions, job, apartment, relationship, were all level 3 or level 4 decisions. They deserved serious consideration, yes, but not endless rumination. "Here's what I'd recommend," David said. "For each decision, set aside 2 hours of focused thinking time, not scattered thinking throughout the day. 2 hours where you sit down with a notebook and really think it through. Consider the options, the pros and cons, your values and priorities." 2 hours seems too short, Jennifer protested. 2 hours of focused thinking is more than most people ever give to major decisions, David countered. Most people either decide impulsively or ruminate endlessly. 2 hours of structured thinking is the middle path. Then what? Then you decide. You make the best choice you can with the information you have, and you commit to it fully for at least 3 months. You don't second guess. You don't keep analyzing. You commit and see what happens. And if it's wrong, then you learn from it and make a different choice. The only truly wrong decision is refusing to decide at all. Jennifer looked skeptical, but intrigued. "I'll try it." 3 weeks later, Jennifer sent David a message. "I did it. Used your approach. Made all 3 decisions. Job. Declined. Keeping my current role with a new project. I'm excited about apartment. Staying, but negotiated a rent reduction. Relationship. Having an honest conversation tonight about whether we want the same things. I don't know if these are the right choices, but I feel lighter than I have in months. Thank you. David smiled, reading the message. Jennifer was learning what he'd learned. The relief of decision is often more valuable than the perfection of the decision. Another person David helped was Marcus, a graduate student, paralyzed by overthinking his dissertation topic. I've been researching for 8 months, Marcus explained. I've read hundreds of papers. I've narrowed it down to 3 possible topics, but I can't choose. Each one has advantages and disadvantages. What if I choose wrong and waste years on the wrong research? David asked him a question, but had helped himself. What if there is no right topic? What if all 3 would lead to good dissertations? Just different dissertations, Marcus frowned. But surely one is objectively better. Maybe, David said. But you can't know that in advance. You can only know it in retrospect, after living with the choice. So the question isn't which topic is objectively best. It's which one are you excited to explore right now, today. I think the second one. Marcus said slowly. It's the riskiest, but also the most interesting to me. Then do that one. But, no buts, David interrupted gently. You just told me which one excites you. That's your answer. The rest is just fear, dressed up as analysis. Marcus chose the second topic. 6 months later, he sent David a draft of his first chapter. This is exactly where I needed to be, he wrote. Thank you for helping me see that excitement is often better guidance than exhaustive analysis. David helped a recently divorced father named Tom, who was overthinking every parenting decision. He helped a small business owner named Lisa who was paralyzed by analysis when trying to expand. He helped a college student named Alex, who couldn't choose a major despite being in his 3rd year. Each conversation taught David something new about overthinking. It manifested differently in different people, triggered by different fears, maintained by different beliefs, but the core principles remained consistent. Distinguish thinking from overthinking. Apply proportional analysis. Take action despite uncertainty. Build confidence through imperfect experience. Trust yourself to handle whatever happens. These weren't just techniques for him anymore. They were principles he could share, approaches that helped people escape the mental traps they'd been living in. David realized that his own struggle had given him something valuable, empathy and understanding that allowed him to help others. He wasn't a therapist or a coach by training, but he had the credibility of having lived the problem and found a way through. 2 years after his breakthrough, David's relationship with overthinking had fundamentally changed, but it wasn't a problem he'd solved once and for all. It was more like a tendency he'd learned to manage. Overthinking still emerged sometimes, especially during stressful periods or major life changes. The difference was that now David recognized it quickly and had tools to address it. When Emma got a job offer in a different city, David felt the familiar pull of endless analysis. Should they move? What about his job? What about their friends and community? What if they moved and regretted it? What if they didn't move and missed an opportunity? He caught himself 3 hours into a mental spiral and stopped. He applied his own frameworks. Decision level. Level 4, major life decision. Deserved serious consideration. Time allocation. Given the decision's importance, he allocated 3 focused thinking sessions over 1 week. Information needed. They needed to know about his job, transfer options, housing costs in the new city, and whether the opportunity aligned with Emma's career goals. Action items. Research those 3 specific things, then decide. David spent 3 evenings gathering that information. Then he sat down with Emma, and they made a decision together. They would move. The opportunity was strong. His company had a remote work option, and they were young enough that relocating felt like an adventure rather than a disruption. Did David know for certain it was the right choice? No, but he knew it was a good choice, made with appropriate consideration, and that was enough. The move itself reinforced everything David had learned. Things didn't go perfectly. Their moving truck was delayed. Their first apartment had issues they hadn't noticed during the viewing. David's remote work arrangement took 2 months to get approved instead of the 2 weeks he'd expected. Old David would have spiraled, analyzing what he should have done differently, whether they'd made a mistake. New David shrugged and adapted. The truck delay was annoying, but not catastrophic. They addressed the apartment issues, one by one. The work approval delay was frustrating, but he used vacation days to bridge the gap. Problems weren't evidence of poor decision-making. Problems were just problems, things to be solved, not endlessly analyzed. Emma watched him handle the stress of moving without falling back into overthinking, and one night she said something that stuck with him. "You've become someone who trusts himself. That's the real change." She was right. The techniques and frameworks were useful, but the fundamental shift was about trust. David had learned to trust his judgment, his resilience, his ability to handle uncertainty. This trust wasn't naive or overconfident. It was based on evidence, hundreds of decisions over 2 years that had turned out fine, even when they weren't perfect. At his new remote job setup, David found himself mentoring more people, both formally and informally. His reputation as someone who could help with decision-making and overthinking had followed him. He developed a simple workshop that he'd run occasionally for colleagues who struggled with overthinking. The workshop covered the neuroscience of overthinking, so people understood what was happening in their brains, the decision hierarchy, so people could right-size their analysis. The 8 practices giving people concrete tools, shared experiences, letting people realize they weren't alone in this struggle. The feedback was consistently positive. People felt seen, understood, and equipped with practical approaches. One participant, a woman named Rachel, sent him a note afterward. "I've been to therapy for my anxiety. I've read books about overthinking, but your workshop was the first thing that gave me practical tools I could use immediately. Thank you for turning your struggle into something that helps others." David realized that this had become part of his purpose, not his career. He was still an engineer and enjoyed that work, but a meaningful way to impact people's lives. He started a small blog where he shared his experiences and frameworks. He didn't market it aggressively. He just wrote when he had something to say. But slowly it found an audience. People struggling with overthinking found his writing and felt less alone. The blog comments section became a community. People shared their own stories, their own techniques, their own breakthroughs. David moderated lightly, mostly just letting people support each other. One comment particularly moved him. A user named Sarah M wrote, "I've been overthinking for so long that I thought it was just who I am. Reading your story showed me that it's not an unchangeable personality trait. It's a habit, and habits can be changed. I'm 3 months into practicing your frameworks, and I'm sleeping through the night for the first time in years. Thank you for showing that change is possible." David read that comment multiple times. It's not who I am, it's a habit that encapsulated the entire journey. For years, David had believed overthinking was his identity. He was the careful one, the thorough one, the one who thinks things through. Changing felt like losing himself, but he hadn't lost himself. He'd found himself. The real David had been there all along, just buried under patterns of thought that didn't serve him. In his 3rd year post-breakthrough, David attended a meditation retreat, not because he was struggling, but because he was curious about deepening his mental clarity. During one session, the teacher said something that resonated deeply. The mind's job is to think. That's what it does, just as the heart's job is to pump blood. Overthinking isn't the mind doing something wrong. It's the mind doing its job without proper boundaries. This reframed everything David had learned. He'd been approaching overthinking as an enemy to defeat. But maybe it was more like a river that needed banks. The flow was natural and necessary, but without boundaries, it became flooding. Thinking was good. Analysis was valuable. Careful consideration served him well. The problem wasn't thinking itself. It was thinking without proportionality, without stopping points, without boundaries. After the retreat, David refined his understanding. He wasn't trying to think less. He was trying to think appropriately, and appropriate thinking had 3 characteristics: proportional to the decision's import. 2. Focused on actionable factors rather than uncontrollable outcomes. Time-bounded, with clear decision points. These 3 boundaries turned his mental river from destructive flooding into productive flow. Back home, David applied this refined understanding for work projects. He'd define thinking boundaries up front. I'll spend Tuesday afternoon analyzing these 3 architecture options, then decide by Wednesday morning. The boundaries created focus and prevented endless deliberation. For personal decisions, he'd ask, what factors in this decision can I actually control or influence? He'd focus his thinking there and deliberately release factors outside his control. For both professional and personal decisions, he'd set clear decision deadlines. I'll decide by Friday, or I'll decide after I have these 3 pieces of information. The deadlines prevented thinking from becoming a permanent state. This approach wasn't about rushing or being careless. It was about being intentional with mental energy. David also developed a deeper appreciation for the concept of good enough. In Western culture, particularly in achievement-oriented environments, good enough can sound like settling. It can sound like lack of ambition or excellence. But David learned that good enough was actually sophisticated thinking. It meant understanding that pursuing perfection often meant sacrificing other values, like timeliness, sanity, relationships, or the opportunity to learn through action. Good enough meant asking, what level of quality does this actually require? And then delivering that level without over-delivering to the point of diminishing returns. For a critical work presentation to executives that deserved high polish, not perfection, because perfection doesn't exist, but high quality. For an internal team, email, good enough, meant clear communication, not literary excellence. For choosing a restaurant, good enough meant it had decent reviews and was convenient. It didn't need to be the optimal choice among all possible restaurants within a 20-mile radius. This discrimination, knowing what deserved what level of effort, was a form of wisdom that overthinking had previously obscured. David shared this concept with his team at work, and it transformed their culture. People stopped over-engineering solutions to simple problems. They stopped spending 3 days polishing presentations that only needed to be clear. They delivered good work quickly instead of perfect work slowly. Ironically, their output quality improved, not because the individual pieces were more polished, but because they were completing more projects, learning faster from each one, and iterating based on real feedback rather than theoretical perfection. Robert, David's manager, noticed this shift. Your team has become the most productive in the department, he told David, but they also seem the least stressed. How are you doing that? We practice strategic mediocrity, David said with a smile. We're excellent at the things that matter and deliberately mediocre at everything else. Robert laughed. That's probably the best management philosophy I've heard in years. In his personal life, David applied the same principle. He was an excellent partner to Emma, attentive, present, communicative, but he'd stopped trying to be the perfect partner because perfect didn't exist. He was a good friend, reliable, supportive, there when it mattered. But he'd stopped overthinking every text message or social interaction. He maintained his health, exercised regularly, ate reasonably well, got enough sleep. But he'd stopped optimizing every aspect of his diet and fitness routine. Good enough in these areas freed up energy and attention for what really mattered. Being present, being available, being genuinely engaged with life rather than constantly analyzing it. Emma noticed this evolution. Used to try so hard at everything, she observed one evening. Now you're more relaxed, but somehow you're also more effective. It's paradoxical. David considered this. I think I've learned that trying hard and getting good results aren't always connected. Sometimes trying hard is necessary, but other times relaxing and trusting yourself gets better results with less suffering. That's very zen, Emma said with a smile. Maybe, David agreed. Or maybe it's just efficient. Why exhaust yourself pursuing perfection when good enough achieves your actual goals? This philosophy extended to how David handled setbacks and mistakes. He made a significant error at work, a code deployment that caused a temporary service disruption. In his overthinking days, this would have triggered weeks of mental torture, analyzing what he should have done differently, catastrophizing about his reputation and career. Instead, David handled it directly. He immediately informed his manager, worked with his team to fix the issue, conducted a post-mortem to prevent recurrence, and then moved on. Aren't you worried about how this looks? A colleague asked him. I made a mistake. We fixed it. We learned from it, David said. Spending mental energy beyond that doesn't help anyone. The mistake is in the past. My attention needs to be on the present and future. This wasn't cavalier or careless. It was accepting that mistakes were inevitable, learning what could be learned, and then releasing the mental grip. The colleague looked thoughtful. I would have spent weeks beating myself up over this. I used to do that too, David said. But I realized that self-flagellation doesn't prevent future mistakes. Learning and improving does. So I focus my energy there. 4 years into his journey, David and Emma had their first child, a daughter they named Maya. Becoming a father opened new dimensions in David's understanding of overthinking. The overthinking impulse returned with force during Emma's pregnancy. Is the baby healthy? Are we ready? What if something goes wrong during delivery? Are we making the right parenting choices? But now David had tools and perspective. He recognized these thoughts as normal parental anxiety, not signals that something was wrong. He applied his frameworks, sought appropriate information, and then trusted that he and Emma would figure things out as they went. Maya's birth was healthy and uneventful, and parenthood was simultaneously exactly what David expected, and nothing like he'd imagined. The first few months were hard. Sleepless nights, constant feeding, the overwhelming responsibility of caring for a tiny human. But David approached it with the same philosophy he'd developed. Be present, do his best in each moment, and accept that perfection was impossible and unnecessary. What struck him most was watching a human develop without overthinking. Baby Maya didn't analyze whether to cry when hungry, deliberate about whether to smile, or ruminate about whether reaching for a toy was the right decision. She simply responded to her needs and impulses directly. Of course, a baby's simplicity wasn't a model for adult decision-making. Adults have to think, plan, consider consequences. But watching Maya reminded David of something important. The default human state isn't overthinking. Overthinking is learned. As Maya grew into a toddler, David watched her develop language and reasoning. He saw the moment when she started to anticipate consequence. If I touch that, Daddy will say no. He was fascinated by the question, how do you teach a child to think carefully without teaching them to overthink? David didn't want Maya to be impulsive or careless. He wanted her to develop good judgment. But he also didn't want her to inherit his old patterns, to spend her life paralyzed by analysis. He started developing what he called decision scaffolding for Maya. As she got older and faced age-appropriate choices, he'd guide her through proportional thinking. We're at the ice cream shop. They have 10 flavors. How should we choose? If 3-year-old Maya started to get overwhelmed, David would scaffold. Let's use the quick choice method. Pick 2 that look good. Now between those 2, which one sounds better right now? Simple, quick. We're teaching a decision process. When 5-year-old Maya was upset about a playground conflict, David helped her think it through without ruminating. What happened? How did you feel? What do you want to happen next time? Okay, what's one thing you could do differently? Solution focused, not analysis paralyzed. Emma worried sometimes, but David was teaching Maya to make decisions too quickly. Shouldn't we be teaching her to think things through carefully? We are, David said. We're teaching her to think proportionally. Small decisions quickly, big decisions carefully. That's the skill that matters. David also made sure to model healthy decision-making. When making family decisions, he'd verbalize his process. Mummy and I are deciding where to go on vacation. This is a level 3 decision. Important, but not life-changing. So we're going to spend tonight each researching options. Tomorrow we'll discuss our top 3 choices, and by the weekend we'll decide. Then we stop thinking about it and get excited about the trip we chose. He wanted Maya to see that thinking had structure and endpoints, that decisions got made, that life moved forward. One evening, when Maya was 6, she came to David with a problem. I can't decide if I should do art class or soccer, she said. I like both. What if I choose wrong? David's heart clenched. This was it, the moment when overthinking could seed itself in his daughter's mind. He knelt down to her level. Maya, here's a secret about choices. Most times, there's no wrong answer. There are just different answers that lead to different experiences. But what if I like the other one better? The next session, you can choose the other one. Choices aren't usually forever. And you know what? When you're doing art class, you'll enjoy art class. When you're doing soccer, you'll enjoy soccer. Your brain is good at enjoying whatever you choose. Really? Really? So the question isn't which is objectively better. The question is right now, this moment, which sounds more fun to you? Maya thought for maybe 3 seconds. Soccer. Great, let's sign you up. But, no buts, David said gently. You chose. Trust your choice. We're doing soccer, and it's going to be fun. Maya did soccer that session, and loved it. The next session, she chose art, and loved that too. She learned that choices worked out, that she could trust her instincts, that she didn't need to agonize to make good decisions. David realized he was giving Maya something he'd had to learn painfully as an adult, the confidence to make decisions without overthinking them. While David had made tremendous progress, he discovered that certain overthinking patterns were more stubborn than others. These weren't the everyday decisions that he'd learned to handle quickly. They were deeper patterns, often rooted in fear or past experiences, that required more sophisticated approaches. One pattern that persisted was what he called catastrophic forecasting, the tendency to imagine worst-case scenarios in vivid detail. Even though David had learned to interrupt this pattern in the moment, it kept returning, especially during times of stress or transition. When Emma was offered a promotion that would require more travel, David found himself immediately projecting disaster scenarios. What if something happened to Maya while Emma was away? What if the added responsibility damaged Emma's health? What if the travel put strain on their relationship? These weren't rational concerns backed by evidence. They were catastrophic fantasies, and David recognized them as such. That recognition alone wasn't enough to stop them. He realized he needed advanced techniques for these persistent patterns. Through research, therapy, and experimentation, he developed what he called the deep pattern protocol. The first element was pattern mapping. David started tracking when catastrophic thoughts appeared, what triggered them, and what they had in common. He kept a detailed log for 1 month. What he discovered surprised him. The catastrophic thoughts weren't random. They followed predictable patterns. They appeared most often when he felt a loss of control. Emma's travel meant less control over her safety. Changes at work meant less predictability in his environment. Even positive changes, like Maya starting school, triggered the pattern because they represented unknowns he couldn't control. The root wasn't actually about the specific scenarios he imagined. It was about his discomfort with uncertainty and lack of control. This insight was powerful because it meant he didn't have to address each catastrophic thought individually. He needed to address the underlying pattern, his relationship with uncertainty and control. David worked with a therapist who specialized in cognitive behavioral therapy. Together, they developed exercises specifically designed to increase his tolerance for uncertainty. One exercise was called deliberate uncertainty practice. Each week, David would intentionally create a small situation where he didn't know the outcome and couldn't control the result. He'd take a different route home without checking traffic first. He'd try a new restaurant without reading reviews. He'd delegate an important task to a team member without micromanaging the process. These exercises were uncomfortable at first. His mind wanted to plan, predict, control. But each time he survived the uncertainty, each time things worked out fine, or he handled the unexpected successfully, his tolerance increased. Another technique was worst-case rehearsal. Instead of fighting catastrophic thoughts, David would deliberately walk through them to their logical conclusion. When he imagined Emma getting hurt while traveling, instead of trying to suppress the thought, he'd think it through completely. Okay, if that happened, what would I actually do? I'd fly to be with her. I'd make sure Maya was cared for. We'd handle it together. It would be hard, but we'd get through it. This wasn't dwelling on negativity. It was demonstrating to his anxious brain that even worst-case scenarios were survivable. The catastrophic thoughts lost some of their power when he proved he could handle even the catastrophes. Dr. Morrison's research supported this approach. Avoidance strengthens anxiety, she explained in one of her papers. When you constantly try to push away frightening thoughts, your brain learns that those thoughts are dangerous and need to be avoided. But when you deliberately engage with the thoughts and walk through them calmly, your brain learns they're just thoughts, uncomfortable, but not dangerous. David also discovered that some of his overthinking patterns were connected to perfectionism, not just in his decisions, but in his identity. He had built his self-worth on being the responsible one, the careful one, the person who thinks things through. This identity created pressure. If he made a quick decision that turned out poorly, it threatened his sense of self. If he missed something in his analysis, it meant he'd failed at being who he was supposed to be. Working through this required examining his beliefs about worth and value. Did his value as a person really depend on never making mistakes? Did being responsible really mean predicting every outcome? Was being careful the same as being paralyzed? These were deep questions that didn't have quick answers, but exploring them helped David loosen the grip of perfectionism on his identity. He started practicing self-compassion, a concept he'd initially dismissed as self-indulgent. But research by Dr. Kristen Neff showed that self-compassion actually improved decision-making and reduced rumination. When David made a mistake, now, instead of harsh self-criticism, "How could you be so stupid?" he'd respond with self-compassion. "That didn't work out how you hoped. That's okay. Everyone makes mistakes. What can you learn from this?" This wasn't about lowering standards or accepting poor performance. It was about responding to mistakes the way he'd respond to a friend, with kindness and constructive feedback, rather than harsh judgment. The shift was subtle, but profound. Self-criticism had always felt like motivation, like holding himself accountable, but in reality, it just made mistakes more painful, which made him more afraid of making them, which increased his overthinking. Self-compassion, counterintuitively, made him more willing to take decisive action, because he trusted that even if things went wrong, he'd treat himself with kindness rather than cruelty. David also explored the role of values in decision-making. He realized that much of his overthinking came from trying to make correct decisions without being clear on what correct meant. Working with his therapist, he identified his core values: growth, connection, contribution, and authenticity. These became his decision-making compass. When facing a difficult choice, instead of endlessly analyzing pros and cons, he'd ask, which option best aligns with my values? This didn't make decisions automatic, but it gave them direction. When work offered him a management position that came with more money, but less hands-on technical work, his old pattern would have been to analyze for weeks. Instead, he asked, which path serves my values better? The technical work aligned with his love of growth and contribution. Through building, the management position aligned with contribution through developing people. Both were valid, but asking the values question clarified what mattered most to him in that moment. He chose to stay in the technical role and felt at peace with the decision because it was grounded in something deeper than pros and cons lists. Another advanced technique David developed was pattern interruption through identity shift. When he caught himself in a familiar, overthinking loop, instead of just stopping the thoughts, he'd shift his entire perspective. If he was overthinking as David the careful planner who needs to consider every angle, he deliberately shift to David the decisive leader who trusts his judgment. The identity shift changed not just his thoughts, but his entire approach to the situation. This wasn't about being fake or inauthentic. It was recognizing that he contained multitudes. He could be both careful and decisive, both thoughtful and action-oriented. The question was, which aspect of himself the situation called for? David also learned about the concept of metacognition, thinking about thinking. He developed the ability to observe his own thought processes with some detachment. When overthinking started, part of his mind would notice, interesting, the overthinking pattern is activating. I can feel the familiar sensation of analysis spiraling. This is the moment where I used to get swept away. This observer perspective created space between him and the thoughts. They were still there, but they felt less consuming, less true, more like weather passing through rather than immutable reality. Over time, David built a sophisticated toolkit for addressing overthinking at multiple levels. Surface level, quick interruption techniques like the 5-second rule or physical movement. Pattern level, addressing recurring themes through exercises and therapy. Root level. Examining core beliefs about control, certainty, perfectionism, and self-worth. Identity level. Redefining himself beyond his thinking patterns. Values level. Grounding decisions in deeper principles rather than endless analysis. Each level required different tools and different work, but together they created lasting change that went beyond just managing symptoms. David realized that his journey with overthinking had become a kind of laboratory for understanding his own mind. Each challenge revealed new patterns. Each pattern, once understood, could be addressed. He wasn't cured of overthinking. He'd come to understand it wasn't an illness to be cured, but a tendency to be managed. But he'd developed such a rich set of tools and such deep self-understanding that overthinking rarely controlled him anymore. When it did emerge, he recognized it quickly, understood what triggered it, and had multiple pathways to address it. Overthinking had gone from being his default state to being an occasional visitor that he knew how to escort to the door. As David's bug grew, something unexpected happened. The comment section evolved into a genuine community of people supporting each other through their overthinking journeys. A user named Michael T. posted, "Day 15 of using the 5-second rule for morning decisions. I've saved approximately 3 hours this week just in my morning routine. This sounds small, but it's transformative. Those 3 hours used to be spent in anxious deliberation. Now they're spent actually living." Another user, Lisa K., responded, "Michael, I'm on day 45. It gets even better. The 5-second rule for small decisions has somehow made bigger decisions easier too. It's like training a muscle." David watched these exchanges with deep satisfaction. People were helping each other, sharing techniques, celebrating progress, offering support during setbacks. The community was doing what he'd hoped, normalizing the struggle and providing practical paths forward. But he also noticed patterns in the struggles people shared. Many were facing obstacles he'd encountered. Some were facing obstacles unique to their situations. This feedback helped David refine his frameworks and develop new approaches. One recurring challenge was what users called the guilt of deciding quickly. Many people reported that even when they successfully made fast decisions, they felt guilty afterward, as if they'd been irresponsible or careless. David addressed this in a blog post, "Speed versus Recklessness. Understanding the Difference." He explained that quick decisions about appropriate matters weren't reckless. They were efficient. Spending 30 minutes deciding what to have for lunch wasn't more responsible than spending 30 seconds. It was just wasteful. Responsibility isn't measured in time spent deliberating, he wrote. It's measured in appropriateness of analysis for the decision's importance. A parent who spends 5 seconds deciding what color cup their child uses is being perfectly responsible. A parent who spends 5 seconds deciding which school their child attends is being reckless. Context matters. This post resonated deeply. Hundreds of people commented about how they'd been conflating thoroughness with time spent, as if more hours of thinking automatically meant better decisions. Another common struggle was dealing with people who didn't understand the change. Several community members reported that friends or family members criticize their new decision-making approach. A user named Jordan Sah wrote, "My sister told me I'm being impulsive now. She's used to me taking forever to decide things. And now that I'm deciding faster, she thinks I'm not thinking things through. How do I explain that I'm actually thinking more effectively, not less?" David responded with a post about managing relationships during transformation. "When you change a long-standing pattern," he wrote, "the people around you have to adjust their expectations and understanding of who you are. This can be uncomfortable for them. They may interpret your change as criticism of how they operate, or they may genuinely worry you're being reckless." He suggested several approaches. Demonstrate through results. Let your outcomes speak for themselves. When your faster decisions lead to good results, people will start to trust your new approach. Explain your process. Help people understand you're not deciding carelessly. You're deciding proportionally. You've simply learned to distinguish between decisions that need extensive analysis and those that don't. Set boundaries. You don't owe everyone an explanation for your decision-making process. It's okay to say, "I've thought about this appropriately for the decision's importance, and I'm comfortable with my choice." Be patient. Give people time to adjust. Your change might be unsettling to them, but they'll likely come around as they see you handling life effectively. The community found this guidance helpful, and many shared their own stories of navigating relationships during their transformation. David also started hosting monthly virtual meetups for the community. These video calls brought together people from around the world who were working on their overthinking patterns. The first meetup had 15 participants. By the 6th month, they'd grown to over 100, requiring multiple sessions to accommodate everyone. During these meetups, people shared their struggles and victories. A software developer talked about how the decision hierarchy had transformed his code reviews. He now distinguished between critical issues that needed extensive discussion and minor style choices that didn't. A graduate student described finally finishing her dissertation after years of perfect seeking paralysis. A new parent shared how David's frameworks had helped her make parenting decisions without the constant anxiety of getting it wrong. What struck David most was the diversity of the community. Overthinking didn't discriminate. It affected people across all backgrounds, professions and life situations. But the core struggle and the core solutions were remarkably consistent. One meetup participant, a retired teacher named Patricia, shared something that moved the entire group. "I'm 67 years old. I've been overthinking my entire life. I thought it was just who I was, that it was too late to change, but these frameworks have given me more mental peace in the last 3 months than I've had in decades." If you're young and finding this information, you're so fortunate, but if you're like me and think it's too late, it's not. The brain can change at any age. Patricia's words became a touchstone for the community. People would reference Patricia's reminder when they felt discouraged or thought change was impossible. David also began partnering with therapists and coaches who wanted to incorporate his frameworks into their practices. He created a facilitator's guide that explained the principles and provided structured exercises for working with clients. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a psychologist in Boston, reached out after using David's frameworks with her anxiety clients. These tools are incredibly practical, she told him during a call. Most cognitive behavioral therapy is excellent, but can feel abstract to clients. Your frameworks give people concrete actions they can take immediately. I've seen faster progress with clients using your decision hierarchy than with traditional approaches alone. This validation from mental health professionals gave David confidence that his experiential wisdom had genuine therapeutic value. He wasn't replacing professional help. He was complementing it with practical tools born from lived experience. The community also started organizing local chapters. Members in the same cities would meet in person, forming accountability groups and support networks. San Francisco had a chapter. So did London, Toronto, Sydney, and Berlin. These local groups reported even more dramatic progress than online-only participants. There was something powerful about sitting across from someone who understood your struggle, who'd been there, who was working on the same transformation. David visited the San Francisco chapter one evening. About 20 people met in a community center, sitting in a circle, sharing their week. A woman named Rachel talked about successfully planning her wedding without overthinking every detail. Old me would have spent 6 months analyzing every possible floor arrangement. New me spent one afternoon, picked options that felt right, and moved on. The wedding was beautiful, and I actually enjoyed the planning process instead of torturing myself through it. A man named James shared his struggle. I'm still getting stuck on work decisions. I've got the personal life decisions down, but at work I freeze. I think it's because the stakes feel higher, or maybe it's the visibility. Other people see the outcomes of my work decisions. The group offered suggestions, shared their own work-related challenges, and collectively problem solved. David watched, barely needing to facilitate. The community had become self-sustaining, with members supporting each other through wisdom gained from their own journeys. As he drove home that night, David reflected on how far this had spread beyond his personal transformation. What had started as his own struggle, his own breakthrough, his own frameworks, had become a movement of sorts, a community of people reclaiming their mental peace from overthinking. He'd never intended to become a voice in this space. He'd simply shared his story, hoping it might help a few people. But it had resonated because the struggle was universal and the solutions were practical. David realized that his overthinking, as painful as it had been, had given him a gift: deep understanding of a widespread problem and the credibility to offer solutions. His suffering hadn't been meaningless. It had been preparation for this work. 5 years after his breakthrough, David was invited to give a talk at a tech company's wellness event. The organizer had found his blog and thought his perspective on overthinking would resonate with their employees. David agreed, though public speaking wasn't something he'd done much. He prepared a presentation that covered his journey, the frameworks he'd developed, and the practical applications for work and life. Standing in front of under 150 people, David felt nervous. Old thoughts tried to surface. What if they think this is stupid? What if I forget what to say? What if no one finds this valuable? But he recognized these thoughts for what they were: overthinking about an event that was already happening. He took a breath, smiled, and started talking. He told them about lying awake at 3 a.m. analyzing email punctuation, He told them about missing opportunities because he was stuck in planning. He told them about the moment he realized his overthinking was absurd. The room was silent, attentive. He could see recognition in many faces. They knew this struggle. He shared his frameworks, his practices, his philosophy of good enough. He talked about proportional thinking, decision hierarchies, and the confidence that comes from imperfect action. When he finished, the applause was warm, but more meaningful was what happened during the Q&A. Person after person shared their own of thinking struggles. A project manager who spent more time planning meetings than the meetings took, an engineer who could never decide when code was ready to ship, a designer who revised work endlessly without ever feeling satisfied. Each person was looking for the same thing: permission to stop overthinking, guidance on how to start, and reassurance that they weren't broken or flawed for struggling with this. David answered questions for an hour, long past the scheduled time. When it finally ended, people lined up to talk to him individually. A young woman named Priya waited until the end. "Thank you for sharing this," she told him, tears in her eyes. "I thought I was the only one. I thought there was something wrong with me. Hearing that someone else went through this and found a way out, it gives me hope." David felt a lump in his throat. "You're not alone," he said, "and you're not broken. You're just using a really powerful tool, your analytical mind, without proper boundaries. You can learn to use it better." "How do I start?" David pulled out one of his business cards and wrote his email on the back. "Email me. I'll send you some resources. But here's the simplest place to start. Tomorrow morning, for just your morning routine, make every decision in 5 seconds or less. Don't try to fix everything at once. Just practice fast decisions for 1 hour with low-stakes choices. See how it feels." Priya nodded, clutching the card like it was precious. Driving home that evening, David reflected on how far he'd come. 5 years ago, he would have spent the entire drive analyzing every moment of the presentation, every word he'd said, wondering if people had judged him, if he'd made mistakes, if the whole thing had been a disaster. Instead, he felt satisfied. The talk had gone well. People had found it valuable. That was enough. He didn't need to analyze it further. He could just let it be complete. When he got home, Emma was putting Maya to bed. David joined them for the end of the bedtime routine. "How was your talk?" Emma asked. "Good," David said simply. "I think it helped some people." Emma smiled. She recognized the growth in that simple answer. No extensive analysis, no overthinking whether it had really gone well, just a straightforward assessment, contentment with it. After Maya was asleep, David and Emma sat on the couch together. Emma leaned against him, and they sat in comfortable silence. "Do you ever miss it?" Emma asked after a while. "Miss what?" "The overthinking. The way you used to analyze everything." "No, it was exhausting, but it was also part of who you were." David considered the question. "No," he said honestly. "I don't miss the overthinking, but I appreciate what it taught me. The struggle made me understand something important about how minds work, and that understanding has let me help other people. So I'm grateful for having gone through it, even though I don't want to go back." "That's a mature perspective," Emma said. "I've had 5 years to develop it," David said with a smile. They sat quietly for a few more minutes. Then Emma spoke again. You know what I've noticed? You laugh more now. You're lighter. You still think deeply about important things, but you're not heavy anymore. Does that make sense? It does, David said. I used to carry the weight of every decision, every choice, every possible outcome. I thought that weight was responsibility, but really, it was just exhausting me without adding value. Now I carry what actually matters and release the rest. I like this version of you, Emma said. Not that I didn't love the old version, but this version seems happier. I am happier, David confirmed. Not because life is perfect or problems don't exist, but because I'm not making everything harder than it needs to be. That night, as David lay in bed, waiting for sleep, he did something he hadn't done in years. He reviewed his day without analyzing it to death. The talk had gone well. He'd connected with people. He'd shared something useful. Priya had been moved by his story, and maybe his advice would help her. Work was going well. His team was productive and healthy. The project they were building was solid. His family was healthy. Maya was growing into a thoughtful, confident kid. Emma was happy in her career. Their relationship was strong. Life wasn't perfect. There were challenges, stressors, uncertainty ahead. But he trusted himself to handle whatever came. With that thought, David fell asleep. No rumination, no mental loops, no 3 a.m. wakings to analyze trivialities. Just sleep. Peaceful, restorative sleep. Overthinking is a peculiar form of suffering. Unlike external hardships that happen to you, overthinking is something you do to yourself, your mind. That magnificent tool that allows you to plan, predict, and problem solve turns inward and begins consuming itself. David Chen's story isn't unique. Millions of people struggle with overthinking, trapped in mental loops that exhaust without producing useful outcomes. The suffering is real, even if it's self-inflicted, but David's story is also hopeful because it demonstrates something crucial. Overthinking isn't a permanent personality trait or an unchangeable flaw. It's a habit, a pattern of thought that was learned and therefore can be unlearned. The journey from chronic overthinking to mental clarity doesn't require you to stop thinking or become careless. It requires you to think proportionally, to recognize the difference between productive analysis and destructive rumination, and to develop the confidence to act despite uncertainty. Dr. Rachel Morrison's research showed that intelligent people are particularly vulnerable to overthinking because their analytical abilities can generate endless scenarios and possibilities. But those same abilities, when properly directed, can be used to develop frameworks for better thinking. The key insights from David's journey can be distilled into core principles. Not all decisions deserve the same mental energy. Use the decision hierarchy to right-size your analysis. Micro decisions deserve seconds, not hours. Major decisions deserve structured time, not endless rumination. Thinking needs boundaries. Your brain will think indefinitely if you let it. Set time limits, decision deadlines, and clear endpoints. Contained thinking is more productive than sprawling analysis. Action interrupts rumination. When you catch yourself overthinking, the fastest escape is through action. Do something concrete. However small, movement breaks mental loops. Perfect is the enemy of good. Most situations don't require optimal solutions. They require good enough solutions, implemented quickly. Learn to recognize what good enough looks like for different contexts. Confidence comes from experience, not analysis. You can't think your way to confidence. You build it by taking imperfect action and discovering you can handle the results. Mistakes are data, not disasters. When you make a wrong choice, extract the lesson and move forward. Extended self-flagellation doesn't prevent future mistakes. It just makes you miserable about past ones. Your thinking is a tool, not your identity. The ability to analyze deeply is valuable, but it's something you do, not who you are. You can choose when to use intense analysis and when to decide quickly. 5 years after his breakthrough, David Chen had become someone who thought clearly without overthinking excessively. He made decisions proportional to their importance. He acted despite uncertainty. He trusted himself to handle whatever outcomes emerged. His career had flourished. His relationships had deepened. His health had improved. But perhaps most importantly, he'd reclaimed mental peace. The constant chatter in his head, the endless analysis, the worried rumination, the exhausting internal debates had quieted, not disappeared entirely, but reduced to appropriate levels. His mind had become a tool he used skillfully rather than a prison he lived in. And he'd discovered purpose in helping others escape their own mental traps. Through his blog, his workshops, his one-on-one conversations, David had guided dozens of people toward the same mental clarity he'd found. Each person's journey was unique, but the destination was the same: freedom from the tyranny of overthinking and the peace that comes from trusting yourself to make good enough decisions and handle whatever follows. If you're reading this and recognizing yourself in David's story, take heart. Change is possible. The neural pathways that make overthinking feel automatic can be redirected. The habit that's exhausting you can be replaced with healthier patterns. Start small. Choose one practice from David's framework. Try the 5-second rule for morning decisions. Use the decision hierarchy to right-size your analysis. Set a timer for 5 minutes of focused thinking, then commit to a choice. You won't change overnight. David's transformation took years, with setbacks and struggles along the way, but gradual progress is still progress. Small improvements accumulate. New patterns slowly become automatic. The goal isn't to stop thinking or to become impulsive. The goal is to think proportionally, to analyze appropriately, to decide decisively, and to move forward confidently. Your life is happening now, in this moment. Every minute spent overthinking is a minute you're not fully living. Every decision, paralyzed by analysis, is an opportunity delayed or lost. But every moment also offers a choice. You can continue the old pattern, or you can interrupt it. You can follow the well-worn path of overthinking, or you can start walking a new trail. The path out of overthinking isn't complicated, but it does require consistent practice. It requires catching yourself in the pattern, interrupting it, and replacing it with healthier responses, again and again, until the new pattern becomes automatic. David Chen lay awake one night, years after his transformation, listening to Emma's soft breathing beside him and Maya's occasional sleep sounds from her room down the hall. His mind was quiet, peaceful, present. He thought about the person he used to be, exhausted, anxious, trapped in endless mental loops. He thought about the journey that had brought him here. He thought about the people he'd been able to help along the way. And then he stopped thinking and simply existed in that moment, grateful, content, at peace. This is what lies on the other side of overthinking, not the absence of thought, but the presence of peace, not thoughtlessness, but thoughtfulness without torture, not carelessness, but confidence. You can get there. David did, and so can you. The journey begins with a single step, recognizing that overthinking isn't serving you, and deciding you're ready for something different. Are you ready? End.